I woke up to a sound I'd never expect on a lazy Saturday morning. A loud clanging, followed by voices echoing through my window like a mini concert was happening in my backyard. For a second, I thought it was the garbage truck rumbling through, way too early as usual. But as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and squinted through the blinds, I froze. No, this wasn't just garbage day. My heart dropped when I saw it. My backyard, the one place I cherished for peace and quiet, was being turned into something else entirely. There were rows of folding chairs, an archway covered in flowers, and people rushing around setting up for what looked like a damn wedding. And there she was, the one person I had dreaded seeing. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, with her arms crossed like she owned everything in sight. She was barking orders at everyone, acting like she had the authority to rearrange the entire neighborhood. And apparently, my yard was her latest conquest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real, could it? I had to be dreaming. But no, as I blinked and rubbed my eyes again, there she was, in the center of the chaos, standing proudly on my property like it was her kingdom. I didn't hesitate. I threw on a hoodie, stormed outside, and marched straight up to her. I had no idea how this was happening, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let it slide. "Karen!" I shouted, not caring who heard me. "What the hell is going on here?" She turned to me slowly, her face lighting up with that smug smile I had come to know all too well. "Oh, Jake, you're finally up," she said, as if we were old friends chatting over coffee. "We were starting to think you were going to sleep through the whole thing." Sleep through what? My mind was racing, still trying to process what was going on. "The whole what?" I asked, my voice sharp. "This is my yard, Karen. What are you doing here?" She laughed lightly, like I was overreacting. "Don't be so dramatic, Jake. It's just for today. My daughter's wedding. You remember, right? We sent out notices weeks ago. It's a community event and your yard was chosen." She gestured around like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my jaw tighten. "No, Karen, I don't remember, because no one asked me. This is my property, and I never agreed to any of this." I was seeing red now. How dare she just take over my space like this, like it was a public park? She didn't even flinch. Instead, she waved me off like I was a petulant child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, Jake, we sent out notices. You should feel honored, really. It's not every day that someone gets picked for such an important event. The community's been buzzing about it for weeks." I scanned the yard again, trying to keep my cool, but it was hard. A DJ was setting up speakers, a catering truck was parked in my driveway, and I even spotted a portable bathroom being rolled onto my front lawn. A portable bathroom, in my yard. My blood pressure spiked. I took a deep breath, trying to control my anger. "I don't care about your notices," I said, my fists clenching at my sides. "Get this stuff out of my yard right now, Karen, or I swear I'll—" She cut me off with that same infuriating smile, but there was something colder in her eyes now. "Oh, Jake, you're really going to make this difficult, aren't you? Do you really want to be the only one in the neighborhood who ruins my daughter's special day?" My blood boiled. "I don't give a damn about your daughter's wedding. This is trespassing. You don't have permission to be here." I was beyond done with her antics. But of course, Karen wasn't fazed. She simply raised one hand, dismissing me like I was nothing. "Jake, Jake, Jake," she sighed. "You're being unreasonable. According to HOA regulations, we're allowed to host community events in any available space that's deemed suitable by the board. And guess what? The board decided your yard is perfect for today. So, unless you want to get fined for unauthorized modifications to your property, I suggest you stop being so difficult." My stomach twisted. This wasn't just some small issue anymore. I knew that Karen had manipulated the HOA board for years, But this was next level. She had essentially hijacked my backyard for her wedding, and I was powerless to stop it. At least, that's what it seemed like. I wasn't going to let her win, though. Not like this. "You've got no right to do this, Karen," I snapped, my voice shaking with frustration. "This is my property, and you're going to just walk all over me like it's nothing." I couldn't believe this was happening. She raised an eyebrow and looked at me like I was the one in the wrong. "Oh, but I do have the right, Jake. You see, the HOA rules say we can hold events in any space deemed suitable by the board, and your yard was deemed suitable. And if you try to fight this, you'll be facing some pretty hefty fines. Let's see. Unsightly lawn, unauthorized modifications to your property, parking violations." My jaw clenched. She was already making threats, and I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to bully me into submission, using the HOA as her personal weapon. The fines were just the start. If I didn't back down, she'd find a way to make my life miserable. Again, I needed a plan, and fast. The wedding was happening in less than 6 hours, and my backyard was already halfway transformed into a full-blown event venue. The caterers were unloading trays of food, the florists were decking out the place with flowers, and a group of bridesmaids were taking selfies by my koi pond. I could feel the heat rising in my face. Karen had gone too far this time. I stormed back into my house, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing. I couldn't just call the cops. Karen had wrapped everything in enough HOA red tape to make it look official. I needed something bigger, something that would take her down for good. I glanced out the window, watching the chaotic scene unfold in my yard. I had to act fast. And when I did, Karen was going to regret ever stepping foot on my property. I had a plan forming in my head, and it was wickedly brilliant. Karen wanted a wedding in my backyard. Fine. She would get exactly what she asked for, but I wasn't going to let her have a perfect day. Oh no, not if I had anything to say about it. I was furious, pacing back and forth in my kitchen like a trapped animal. My mind was racing, my thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of frustration. I couldn't believe this was happening. Karen had completely taken over my yard, turning it into a wedding venue without my permission, and now she was trying to pull every trick in the book to make it seem like she had the right to do it. My blood was still boiling from our confrontation, and the worst part was, I knew she was right in some twisted way. The HOA had given her the green light. They'd approved this disaster, and now I was stuck with a mess of floral arrangements, overpriced catering, and, worst of all, Karen's smug face in the middle of it all. The thought of her sitting there, acting like she owned the entire neighborhood, made me want to scream. But I couldn't just throw in the towel. I had to find a way to turn the tables, to hit her where it hurt. The only problem was, I had to be smart about it. If I made the wrong move, I'd be the one facing consequences. But if I did this right, I'd get my yard back, and I'd make sure Karen never tried this again. As I stared out the window at the madness unfolding, an idea began to form. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. The sprinkler system. The old, disgusting sprinkler system that I hadn't used in years. The one with pipes that were so rusty and filthy that the water that came out was practically brown. The water that smelled like iron and dirt. It was the perfect weapon. Karen and her wedding planners were so caught up in their little dream day, they wouldn't even notice what was happening until it was too late. I could turn her pristine wedding into a swamp. I could flood the whole damn yard, ruin every bit of her carefully crafted setup, and leave her with a nightmare she wouldn't forget. The thought of it sent a thrill through me, but I knew I had to be patient. Timing was everything. If I did this too soon, she might be able to salvage things. But if I waited until the ceremony was underway, when everyone was gathered and all the guests were in place, the chaos would be total. She wouldn't be able to recover. And maybe, just maybe, I could finally get her to back off and stop using the HOA as her personal playground. But I had to move fast. I could already hear the sound of laughter and chatter outside as more guests arrived. The setup was nearly complete, and there was no turning back now. I grabbed my toolbox and headed to the garage. As I walked through my house, I could hear the music starting to play outside. The DJ had begun testing the sound system. The caterers were unloading trays of food that looked way too expensive for my taste. I couldn't help but feel a pang of anger every time I saw the scene unfolding through my windows. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my place to relax and enjoy the peace and quiet I'd worked hard for. Instead, it was now a stage for Karen's little wedding fantasy. I didn't waste any time once I reached the garage. I pulled open the cabinet with the old sprinkler system controls and began making the necessary adjustments. The pipes were ancient, but I knew how to handle them. I had a plan, and it was simple. I just needed to flip the switch and let the dirty water pour out. I could already picture it. The way the guests would shriek as the water sprayed over them. The way the pristine decorations would dissolve into mud. The thought made me grin. It was going to be a disaster of epic proportions, and Karen was going to be the one holding the bag. I could already hear her frantic voice, screaming at her wedding planners and vendors as everything fell apart. It was going to be glorious. But I had to wait. If I pulled the trigger too early, I'd give her the chance to salvage the day. No, I needed to wait until the last possible moment. The moment when the guests were seated, when everything looked perfect on the surface. Then, I'd hit her with the flood. I watched through the window as the final touches were added to the setup. A few bridesmaids were posing for pictures by my koi pond, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Everything looked so perfect from the outside, and that's exactly when I was going to strike. I took a deep breath, checking the time. 2 hours. That's how much time I had left before the ceremony started. I paced the kitchen again, feeling the tension build in my chest. The anticipation was almost too much to handle, but I had to stay focused. One wrong move, and Karen would turn the whole thing on me. I needed to be patient. I couldn't rush this. The stakes were too high. The sound of my phone buzzing interrupted my thoughts. I grabbed it, seeing that it was Tom, one of the few reasonable people in the neighborhood who had been watching this whole mess unfold. He was a decent guy, someone who saw through Karen's act. He knew what she was capable of. "Hey, Jake," his voice came through, a little hesitant. "I heard what's going on. Are you okay?" I rubbed my temples. "Okay?" "Tom, I've got my backyard turned into a wedding venue without my permission, and Karen's acting like she's the queen of the neighborhood. I don't know what to do. She's already threatening me with fines and violations. It's a mess." "Yeah," he said with a sigh. "I figured. Look, I don't know what you're going to do, but I do know this. Karen's not as invincible as she thinks. She's been pulling strings with the HOA for years, but there's a crack in her armor. If you push back, she won't be able to manipulate her way out of it. And honestly, if you don't stop her now, she's just going to keep walking all over you and everyone else." I paused. "So you're saying I should fight back?" Tom's voice dropped lower. "Look, you didn't hear this from me, but I've got a little inside scoop. Karen didn't just pick your yard because it was a nice spot for a wedding. She picked it because she blew the HOA event fund on herself. There was supposed to be a real venue, but she used the money for personal expenses. Now she's trying to cover it up by forcing your property into service." The words hit me like a punch. I couldn't believe it. Karen had been so busy trying to manipulate everyone that she'd made a huge mistake. This wasn't just a petty HOA battle. She had used the HOA's own funds to fund her personal agenda. I couldn't let this go, not anymore. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, my anger growing. "I've got a plan. I'll make sure this wedding is the worst disaster Karen's ever seen. Tom hesitated before speaking again. Just, whatever you do, don't destroy the whole wedding. I know you want to get back at Karen, but there's no need to ruin everyone's day, especially Stephanie's. I thought about that for a second. You're right. It's not her fault her mother is a nightmare, but I'm still going to make sure Karen pays for this. The phone call ended, and I was left with one thing on my mind: revenge. It wasn't just about ruining Karen's day. It was about showing her that no one, not even her, could get away with this level of manipulation and entitlement. I knew I had to make my move soon. I grabbed my toolbox and headed outside. The water was ready. The sprinkler system was primed. Now all I had to do was wait for the perfect moment. The clock was ticking, and Karen was about to get a rude awakening. The time had finally come. I stood in my living room, my heart pounding as I watched the chaos unfold in my backyard. The guests were arriving in droves, wearing their best clothes, chatting and laughing like everything was just as Karen had planned. The wedding was about to begin, and my backyard, my peaceful private sanctuary, had been completely transformed into a chaotic wedding venue. It looked like something straight out of a bridal magazine, and that made my blood boil even more. The sight of Karen standing at the front of it all, greeting guests like the queen she thought she was, only fueled my determination. She thought she had won. She thought she had control. She thought this was her moment. But it was mine now. I just had to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. I had checked everything twice, triple-checked it all. The sprinkler system was in place. The dirty, rusty water had been sitting in the pipes long enough, and the controls were ready. All I needed was for Karen to feel completely secure, for her to believe the wedding was going smoothly, and for everyone to be gathered watching. That's when I'd make my move. I'd hit the switch, and in seconds, this perfect wedding would be turned into a nightmare that no one would ever forget. I kept my eyes glued to the window, watching as the guests filled the seats, the ceremony starting to take shape. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle, each one more poised than the last, completely oblivious to what was coming. They had no idea what kind of disaster was waiting for them. I saw the guests start to settle in, murmuring excitedly as the music swelled and the atmosphere became more charged with anticipation. Karen was beaming, looking every bit the proud mother of the bride, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But what she didn't know was that this would be the last moment of peace she would have for the rest of the day. I stood by the window, hand hovering over the switch, watching as everything seemed to fall into place. It had to be perfect. The last of the guests were seated, the last of the chairs set into place, and Karen's smile couldn't have been wider. She didn't even notice me watching from my house, observing from behind the curtains like a silent observer of her perfect little show. She was too busy thinking she had everything under control. But I was in control now. I waited for the right moment. It wasn't going to be when the music started or when the guests were still getting settled. I needed the moment when it looked like the bride was about to make her grand entrance. The moment everyone's eyes would be locked on her, when all attention was on the bride walking down the aisle. That's when I would hit the switch. That's when the chaos would begin. I could already see it. Stephanie, the bride, stepping out onto the yard, looking perfect in her pristine white gown, ready to take the first steps down the aisle. Everyone's eyes on her. And then, boom, a burst of water, dark and filthy, flooding the yard. It would be beautiful, in a twisted way. My heart raced as I counted down the seconds in my head, trying to keep my composure. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. And then it happened. I saw her, Stephanie. She stepped into the yard looking every bit the part of a fairy tale bride. The crowd stood in anticipation. My finger hovered over the switch, and for a split second, I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But no, There was no turning back now. This was the moment. I pressed down on the switch. At first, there was nothing, just a quiet gurgle. No one even noticed. But then, with a sudden whoosh, the underground pipes came to life. The sprinklers burst open, releasing the filthy, rusty water that had been lying dormant for years. And it was worse than I could have imagined. The water wasn't just a little muddy. It was a dark, vile sludge, spraying out in every direction. It hit the guests in the front rows immediately, spraying them with brown, foul-smelling water. The shock was instant. There were screams, confusion, chaos. People jumped out of their chairs, trying to get away from the spray, but it was everywhere. The pristine, expensive decorations that had taken hours to set up were destroyed in seconds. White chairs turned brown. The delicate flowers became soggy lumps of mud. The towering wedding cake that had been so carefully arranged toppled under the weight of the water, collapsing into a pile of ruined sugar and frosting. And it didn't stop there. The water kept coming, flooding every inch of the yard. Guests who had been sitting peacefully, watching the ceremony, were now running, slipping, and stumbling over each other in the mud. The DJs. Speakers sparked, fizzled, and then died as the water reached the electrical equipment. A few bridesmaids screamed, clutching their dresses, trying to shield themselves from the flood of sludge that was now overtaking the yard. The carefully curated aisle was no longer pristine. It was a swamp. The flower petals that had been so carefully arranged were now just wet clumps of mess, floating in the water. I stood there, watching it all unfold with a sick satisfaction. The scene was chaotic. Guests were slipping in the mud, some of them falling flat on their backs, their expensive clothes ruined beyond repair. The bridesmaids were screaming and running for cover, trying to escape the flood, but it was too late. The yard had become a disaster zone. And in the middle of all this, Karen's face, the smug, self-righteous look she'd had just moments before, melted into a mask of absolute horror. I could see the realization hit her. The wedding was over. Her perfect day was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. The bride, Stephanie, had stepped into the yard just moments before everything turned to chaos. Her face froze as she took in the scene, her pristine white dress instantly soaked in the murky water. She let out a scream, lifting the hem of her gown, but it was already too late. The damage was done. Her dress was ruined, stained beyond repair. The guests who hadn't already fled were now standing in shock, their eyes wide as they tried to comprehend what was happening. And there, in the center of it all, was Karen. She was slipping on the wet grass, frantically trying to control the disaster. But it was no use. Nothing could be done to save her wedding now. She was sinking into the mess she had created. I couldn't help but enjoy watching the panic spread across her face. This was her moment of defeat. The one thing she hadn't planned for. And for once, Karen had no control. The scene continued to spiral into madness, but I wasn't done yet. I had waited years for this. For a moment when Karen's hold over me, over the entire neighborhood, could finally be broken. I wasn't just going to let her walk away from this unscathed. As I stepped out onto my porch, I couldn't help but smirk at the mess. Karen's wedding, her precious day, was completely ruined. It was beautiful. And now, it was time for her to face the consequences. I watched her storm across the yard, her heels slipping in the mud as she yelled at the vendors and guests. She was furious, her voice cracking with rage as she scanned the yard, searching for someone to blame. And then, her eyes locked on me. She saw me standing there on my porch, looking like I was the one who had orchestrated her downfall. Well, in a way, I had. But she had brought this upon herself. She stormed toward me, her face flushed with anger. "You did this!" she screeched, pointing a finger at me. I crossed my arms, not even flinching at her fury. Did I? I asked, feigning innocence. Seems like a plumbing issue to me. Maybe you should have booked a real venue instead of hijacking someone else's backyard. The words felt good coming out of my mouth. She was losing it, and I couldn't have cared less. The chaos was only beginning. The chaos that unfolded after I flipped the switch was nothing short of spectacular. The water didn't just spray out in a few random directions. It flooded the yard like a tidal wave, catching everyone off guard. The first few rows of guests were drenched instantly, their designer clothes now ruined in a matter of seconds. They screamed and scrambled to get away from the sudden flood of filthy water, but it was everywhere. It covered the ground, soaked through the chairs, the tables, and every inch of the carefully manicured lawn. The decorations that had taken hours to put together were utterly destroyed. White chairs turned brown in an instant. The delicate flower petals were crushed and became a soggy mess, and the towering wedding cake, the pride of the event, collapsed under the onslaught of the murky water. Guests were stumbling and slipping in the mud, trying to regain their footing, but only making the mess worse. The DJ's equipment sparked and shorted out as water splashed over it, leaving the yard with nothing but the sound of confusion, chaos, and panicked screams. The bridesmaids, once poised and perfect, were now running, trying to escape the mess that had overtaken everything. Their dresses, once pristine, were now caked with mud, and their perfectly styled hair was quickly turning into a frizzy mess. Karen, of course, was in the middle of all of it, her face twisting with disbelief as she realized what had just happened. She had no idea how to react. She stood frozen for a moment, taking in the disaster, before her face contorted in pure rage. The wedding she had so meticulously planned for her daughter was falling apart in front of her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. It wasn't just the damage to the property that rattled her. It was the realization that she had lost control. The worst part was, she was too late to do anything about it. It was already over. I stood there on the porch, arms crossed, watching her frantically run around, trying to salvage whatever she could. But it was hopeless. There was no saving this wedding now. Her precious plans had been turned into a nightmare, and all I could do was enjoy the spectacle. I didn't even care that I was the one who had caused it. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of satisfaction, like the weight of everything Karen had done to me was finally lifting. She was finally paying for all the times she had used her position in the HOA to bully me and everyone else in the neighborhood. Her control was slipping away, and now there was nothing she could do to get it back. I could hear the sound of a commotion as Karen started shouting at her guests and wedding planners, demanding that they get things under control, but it was clear that they had already given up. The guests were no longer focused on the ceremony. Some of them were too busy laughing at the absurdity of the situation, while others were just trying to salvage whatever they could from the disaster that had overtaken them. And as for the bride, Stephanie, well, she was standing at the back of the yard, looking like she was in shock. Her face was pale, her mascara running down her cheeks, and her beautiful white dress was completely ruined. She had stepped into the yard only to find her dream wedding turned into a swamp. I watched as she looked at her mother, tears in her eyes, but there was no help coming. Karen had created this mess, and now Stephanie was the one who had to suffer for it. My heart twisted for her. It wasn't her fault. She didn't deserve this. But Karen's manipulative nature had taken over everything. Her wedding, her life, and now it had destroyed her big day. As Stephanie's eyes filled with tears, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her, even though she was part of the whole mess. She had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. All she knew was that her mother had ruined her wedding. But that didn't mean Karen was going to get off the hook, not after everything she had done. I watched as she stormed toward me, slipping on the wet grass as she trudged through the mud in her heels, her face twisted in anger. She was furious, no doubt about it, and I couldn't wait to see how she tried to talk her way out of this one. As she got closer, she pointed at me with a shaking finger, her voice shrill with rage. "You did this!" she screeched, her face red with fury. I simply raised an eyebrow, not even flinching. "Did I?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Seems like a plumbing issue to me. Maybe you should have booked a real venue instead of hijacking someone else's backyard." The words slipped out easily, and I couldn't help but smirk as I saw her blood pressure rising. She was absolutely livid, and it was all her fault. If she had just respected my boundaries from the start, none of this would have happened. If she hadn't manipulated the HOA and used the board's rules to get away with all of her petty schemes, she wouldn't have ended up here, drenched, angry, and humiliated in front of everyone. Karen stopped in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she tried to come up with a response. But there was no coming back from this. The wedding was over, and so was her reign of terror. Her attempts to control every aspect of this day had failed, and now everyone in the neighborhood could see it. She tried to salvage her dignity, straightening her back and lifting her chin. But it was clear that the damage had been done. She had no more tricks up her sleeve, and the crowd that had once been mesmerized by her power was now starting to whisper among themselves. I could see it happening. The people who used to blindly follow her were starting to realize the truth about what kind of person she really was. The perfect wedding she had tried to orchestrate had turned into a nightmare of her own making, and the crowd was witnessing it all. "Don't think you've won, Jake," Karen hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "You've only made things worse for yourself." I smiled, enjoying every moment. "I think I'm finally getting my yard back, Karen," I said coolly, "and I think you're about to have a lot more to worry about than me." She glared at me, her face contorted with pure hatred. But the more she tried to save face, the more she realized that it was too late. The wedding was ruined. The guests were leaving. The damage had been done. And worst of all, her little secret, how she had used the HOA funds for her personal benefit, was about to come to light. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Karen's grip on the neighborhood was loosening, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the last few guests trudged off, disgruntled and murmuring about the disaster, Karen was left standing alone in the wreckage of her perfect day. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and anger, but it was clear. Her reign was over. I stood there on the porch, watching the last of the guests leave, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. The storm had passed, the wedding was over, and Karen, she was done. The HOA was falling apart, the board members were turning on her, and the police were already breathing down her neck for the mess she had made. She had pushed too far, and now there was no way out. I leaned back against the porch railing, a satisfied smile spreading across my face. The best part? Karen was finally getting a taste of her own medicine, and there was nothing she could do about it. I had won.